A little stretchy. Alright, here we go. Drum roll.
Yo, welcome to The Noob and the Knower. In this podcast, we pair a driven beginner with a seasoned vet to explain how to learn basically anything.
This season's anything is how to fly fish. Stick around as we cover the gamut, 101 to the 401, gear, reading water, fishing techniques, and much, much more.
With star of hit video series Modern Nymphing, Fly Fishing Team USA medalist, and professional guide Lance Egan.
That's right. And here co-hosting and asking the questions on your behalf is avid fly fisher and recently graduated noob Pablo Signori.
So let's go. Together we'll take you from fishing zero
to fly angling hero faster than you can say, fish on.
All right, welcome to The Noob and the Knower, Season 1, Episode 7, y'all. We've made it. This is crazy. 7 episodes in. This is kind of a culminating moment because we've covered so much at this point, and now it's kind of when we get into the brass tacks, the real hard-working stuff. Isn't that right, boys?
Mm-hmm. That's right. The nitty-gritty.
That's right. We are here, obviously, with Mr. Lance Egan, the master of fly fishing, and Mr. Ray Bly, not Blay, which I still want to call him Ray Blay and probably will for the rest of my life, but
I will answer to that.
Another fly fishing extraordinaire that we have locally close to our hearts. But today so the reason it's a kind of a big deal is because if you've made it this far, you know that all these podcasts kind of fit with each other and they build on each other. And this one kind of is at the point now where we're like, okay, now we're fishing. Like, we've learned so much through the first 6 that now we're actually at the point where we can apply these things and we can go to the river and get ready to do the thing. So, we've covered what is fishing, what is fly fishing, what gear to use, what types of tactics to use, casting the fly line, how to find fish, reading water, what flies to use when, and now we're actually going to start getting away from that macro vision and kind of zeroing in on the more micro. So today's topic is going to be dry fly fishing. How do you dry fly fish? When, why, and how? And we're going to cover everything in a much more in-depth kind of real case scenario setting. Does that sound good to you guys?
Perfect.
Sounds good.
I mean, I was talking to the listeners, but if you guys want to answer, that's fine. It was a hypothetical.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think our listeners sound like that.
Yeah, that was Cheech. He's listening.
Hi, Cheech.
So, the couple things I want to talk about with as far as dry fly fishing, before we get into it, there's a couple things that I wanted to mention. Number one, to me, dry fly fishing is like the fried chicken of fly fishing. Okay, why do I say that? It's because fried chicken is one of those things that you can't just eat one bite of. You have to just keep going. It's that good. It's so delicious. You could also make it a Dorito or a Pringle if you wanted to, but it's just you go dry fly fishing and it gets addictive. It's something that it's just so satisfying when you catch fish on a dry fly. So we're going to talk to you about how that happens in a little bit. And before I do that, I just wanted to say that it's kind of interesting, me coming from the noob scenario. I watched Lance's videos. He was a hero of mine. I'm sure I'm going to be putting some hero music in the back of this right now. He was a hero of mine, and I learned a lot from watching what he had put out there and listening to a bunch of podcasts that he was actually on. For some reason, I got the feeling that people don't really understand that he's not just all about nymphing. He's actually this super proficient dry fly fisher. So I decided to ask him, what's the deal with your dry fly fishing? I know you're really good at it. We did a little deep dive, and here's some stats for you. This dude won the Green River single fly tournament with dry flies 2 times. Not just once, 2 times. And he caught 43 fish both times with 1 dry fly the entire tournament. Just 1. It's kind of insane. I've never caught 43 fish. Probably haven't caught 43 fish my whole life. No, that's not true. But
not true.
But that's quite a feat. I mean, I think my max amount of fish in one day, trying everything, throwing the entire book at it, it's been 27 or something like that. So it's kind of nuts to think about. And I'm sure he wasn't fishing in a place that's super easy, because normally these tournaments are not in the easiest places to fish. So that's pretty impressive. But the other thing too is, you're talking about a dude who's a world champion. And to get to that level, a lot of it's dry fly fishing. There's like this misconception that like they only do nymphing, but actually a lot of the times they're dry fly fishing. So I just thought I would clarify that for anyone that hasn't read the news yet, that Lance is actually kind of a real all-star at the dry fly fishing.
Oh, thanks for that. I'm certainly not the best at it. I have lots to learn with dries, but I do enjoy fishing dries. And just to clarify, I'm a world championship medalist, but I've never been the first place Grand Master champion. One day maybe, but not yet.
You stood on the podium. You're a champion to me, bro.
I see. Fair enough.
You got medal. That's all that counts.
I had medal before that. I've been medaling for years. That's a different kind of medal.
We're not talking about the plate in your head, Lance. Okay? Here we go again. Hopefully our listeners don't hate us for all the dad jokes. And hopefully they kind of do. It's kind of like...
They're pretty bad.
Double-edged sword there. The one thing I did want to talk about, because this is something I didn't realize as a noob, and my good friend Stahl Vaughn, he's an amazing Americana artist and insane fly fisher as well. He's had a pretty decent career there in the musics, but he got me into fly fishing actually. And I didn't get this for the first few years, but he told me when the fishing's good, it's like really good. And I just never understood that. And I kept on fishing these places. It was kind of like hard to catch fish, but I would catch them. And then on a couple of my trips, I would get to these places and I would start to realize what he meant. And when the fishing's good, you can fish a dry fly and catch a lot of fish. It's not just like something you do haphazardly with like a dry dropper or something. Like it's just like, okay, this is like lights out right now.
Right.
I just wanted to tell the listeners about that because it's something that I had to learn. It didn't make any sense to me, but there's a difference. Sometimes it's like really hard to catch fish and sometimes not that hard. And then sometimes it's just a lot easier, and it just all depends on season and time of day and like what's happening with the weather and is there a cicada hatch and all these weird factors that come in, so you can't really necessarily predict it, but well, maybe you can with enough educated guessing. But there's definitely a time when the fishing's good, and dry fly fishing is usually the most fun then. So I think when the fishing's good, you can fish a dry fly and be very successful. I guess that's my point.
True.
Without further ado, let's get into this thing, this dry fly fishing. So when you think of dry fly fishing, we said this last time, it's basically, it's like the quintessential kind of poster child for fly fishing. It's using a fly that's floating on the surface of the water. So let's talk about, when do we actually do dry fly fishing, Lance? When's a good time to actually count on it, I guess, as something in your arsenal?
It's a good time. I mean, there are those that will dry fly fish only, so that you could argue there's any time is dry fly time. But to be effective at it, it's most effective when there are hatches, when there are emerging insects, either aquatic insects or even terrestrial insects that end up on the water. So if there's food that's floating on the surface that's readily available and trout are taking advantage of that food on the surface, that's a great time to fish dry flies.
Is there a season that works better, or doesn't matter?
That's variable depending on where you are. I would argue most places the hatches are more consistent in spring, summer, fall.
Okay.
But depending on where you live, maybe the summer gets too warm and it dies. The southeast U.S. has maybe has earlier hatch times than most of the west, for instance. Same with the east coast. Seems like the west is usually more June, July, August for prime hatches, where we have blue-wing olives and a few caddis and midges that would hatch in cooler months. Blue-wings and midges is in really in wintertime versus caddis in late fall or early spring can start showing up. It seems like around here, I live in Utah, as I've mentioned in some of these podcasts, and around here, like May, we're usually experiencing runoff most years, where like in my friends that live in Pennsylvania, in May, they're getting prime hatch time right then. So it varies a bit depending on where you are geographically.
Oh, okay. And there's another thing that I was thinking of from you saying that we haven't actually mentioned on the podcast yet. So he's talking about when's a good time to use dry fly, and obviously you just heard him say spring, summer, and he kind of avoided actually saying in the U.S. when the spring, summer is, using the actual month names until later. And I think that that's very smart, just because one thing about fly fishing specifically for trout is that you can kind of fly fish for trout in many places across the globe.
Right.
From New Zealand to freaking Austria to, the United States, Argentina, Chile. I mean, it's crazy. So,
right.
But wherever you fish for them, the trends kind of are very, very similar. You get a lot of the same insects, and you get a lot of the same things hatching generally. I mean, you could be off by like 3 weeks, a month, or whatever, but it's like generally things are happening at around the same time that they would anywhere else in the world. But just remember that the southern hemisphere is the opposite as far as their seasons go. So if it's winter here, it's summer down there, and vice versa. If you wanted to, you could fish spring summer 2 times a year. You could fish it here in the United States, and then you can go down south someplace and fish it there. So those are options you have for all of my rich listeners.
Take me with you.
Great point. Yeah. Or your trout bum listeners that just chase summer wherever they go, right?
Yeah, there you go. That's true too. Yeah, I think that sums up when we would actually do it. Let's keep moving. And the thing I wanted to ask is, like, when don't you do it? When's not a time to even think about it? I mean, I know there are people that are die hard and they, dry fly till I die. I actually have a t-shirt by Yakota that I'm actually wearing another one. That's how nerdy I am. But they have a dry fly till I die shirt, and it's very metal, and I think it's really well done. And there's people that live their life that way. But if we were just trying to catch the most fish possible, when is a time you don't want to really rely on a dry fly?
Almost any time. Trout do more than 90% of their feeding subsurface, kind of end of story, almost any time. So, I mean, I would argue even in a dense hatch, for every adult that a fish eats, they probably ate 10 nymphs or emergers.
Okay.
But, when you present a dry fly well, I think most anglers relish the opportunity to fish dry flies.
Yeah.
So anytime that you can, right, that you can have even pretty close to similar success throwing dries, most people would. And that time, the time that it's best to throw them is during hatches. The time that it's worst to throw them is when there's no food available on the surface.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, I was in my head, I was even thinking more specifically where I was like, okay, like high water is probably a time you wouldn't want to.
That's a great point.
Even try, or if there's like really turbid water, maybe that's a time.
Really murky water makes it hard to get fish to come up through the water column and eat dries. That's a fact. That said, if it's just runoff, I mean, some like in the west here, a lot of the bigger salmon flies and sometimes golden stones hatch during high water periods. And we often also get caddis that hatch en masse in high water periods where fish will still move to the edges of rivers where you might only have 12 inches, 24 inches of visibility, but the fish will still eat a dry, especially a large dry fly, like a big stone fly.
Interesting.
So you could still fish them in runoff periods, but that's all situational. I use that word a lot, but that's the way fishing is, right? Everything's situational.
There are situations.
All right, cool. Well, I think that's pretty good. I mean, the dry fly thing, it's a specific thing, and it has its time and its place, and so that's okay. It's like it doesn't have to be anything more than it is. I will say that when you catch fish on a dry fly, the reason it's so fun is because you see this thing come up and take it. I remember was it last summer? Yeah, it was last summer. I was in a backcountry fishing trip with my buddy Nick, and we were fishing this river in the Sierras, and I had found this place that had like a beach, and it was like this kind of riffly thing, got to a pinch and then into this pool, and the water was like crystal clear, like beautiful blue.
Cool.
And I was just standing on the beach, and I was actually able to just like cast across stream. It was like super mellow. I didn't have to fight any currents or anything. And it was so fun because you could see the fish actually come up for like 5 feet.
Oh man.
So you could watch the thing come up, grab it, and come down, and it was just like, it seemed like a video game. It was absurd, It was like, am I like on candid camera? Like, how is this possible in nature,
I'll put you on the spot here, but you didn't miss any of those fish, did you?
I missed so many fish. It was crazy. I really did.
Yeah, it's easy to miss. That's why I asked that. It's easy to miss them. When you see them coming from a long way off, you have a tendency to set the hook too soon, which
that's exactly what I did.
I'm sure you're not guilty of, but I've done many a time.
Yeah, it took me a long time to get that dialed. Luckily, there were a lot of happy trout willing to keep going for it.
Cool.
But it was cool. But my point is that it's a very enjoyable way to fish. It's a very fun, pleasing, and satisfying way to fish, and it's super entertaining. I mean, that scenario right there is kind of like the best case scenario because you can just like cast across. You don't have to worry about like mending even too much. You just kind of like let your line flow with it. And you're watching the fish, so it was like a great place to kind of like cut my teeth and whatnot. But even when you can't, it's still kind of fun. Like when I was dry fly fishing in the driftless, and it's like super tight quarters because there's just like these streams are so narrow, and you got to place the thing in the perfect spot, but you have to like crouch and not let them see you, even then that's all this whole other host of things that makes it entertaining. And then when they come up and they take it, it's so fun.
For sure. I think it's what most people envision when somebody that hasn't fly fished before. I think dry fly fishing is the only thing that comes to mind, right? That's what they've seen on a river runs through it. That's what they're envisioning. Most people, when they're brand new, don't have any concept of fishing nymphs below the surface or streamer fishing or saltwater fishing or any of those other parts of fly fishing. They all just think dry fly, and that's awesome because it is everybody's favorite. I mean, as you described very well, it's very visual. Everything's on the surface. You see the fly, you see the take. There isn't much better than seeing a fish take a fly off the surface.
Yeah, and there's one thing also that's like kind of more on some of the diehard, like really, really diehard dry fly anglers like it because you're fooling the fish and you're bringing the fish to you as opposed to you going to them like subsurface. You're actually bringing them up to you. So there's something that's cool about that too. The nature of it is actually like you're bringing the fish up to the surface, which is, it's just a nice little nuance of it, I guess. Let's talk about why you do it. Obviously, one of the reasons why you do it is because it's ridiculously fun to do.
Right.
Another thing that I think that I should mention is that casting is kind of difficult to begin with, but you kind of get the knack for it. And I think a lot of people think that it's hard. When they start, they think fishing dry flies is hard. There's this like stigma. But as far as casting goes, it's like the easiest thing to cast.
Right. Absolutely.
All these things that we kind of have are kind of originally intended to cast just a dry fly. So maybe that's a blanketed statement.
Or swinging wets too.
Sorry. So it was a blanketed statement. The casting aspect of it is much more pleasurable than a lot of the other ways of fishing. And actually, I'm getting my dad into fly fishing right now. He's been out, I think, 3 times at this point, and he only wants to fish dry flies. He kind of made it his thing. And he's like, I'm still learning how to cast and like all this other stuff. It just seems so complicated. This is just so simple. I just put a fly on, I just tie one knot, and I'm rolling. Mm-hmm. And it makes sense too because, it's really easy to handle it equipment-wise. It's just like totally simple. There's not much to it. So that's another reason why you would do it.
It's Ray Ray. I think we kind of hit it before, but for me, there's nothing more satisfying than just watching a fish come up and eat a well-placed dry fly. It's, there's I think a good level of accomplishment in that is that, you put the cast where it needed to be in a feeding lane for a fish. You did the part of fooling it to actually think that you had something, real on the end of the line. And it was, I think that's a truly accomplishing feeling, especially for a new angler, to be able to go out and do that and be like, all right, cool, I did that, and kind of get some comfort underneath you.
I agree with that because that's definitely me.
We all need that level of self-worth when we go fishing.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. I mean, as we've touched, it's just so much fun. Mm-hmm. It's my favorite way to trout fish for sure. Dries. I think it's also important to note that it's probably the easiest way to get somebody into it rigging wise. I don't know that I would say it's necessarily the easiest way to get somebody to catch fish, but it's a brand new beginner, like you mentioned, is going to be able to cast a single dry a lot easier. They're going to be able to see where their fly is going. They don't have to worry about achieving different depths or snagging stuff on the bottom like you would with a nymph rig, or adjusting weight or an indicator. The rigging is so much easier. You just get a taper leader, attach it to your fly line, and tie a fly on the end of it and go. It's not quite that simple all the time. There's with picky fish, it requires a bit more, but you could go to a high mountain stream or a lake for that matter, where the fish are not very educated and have just a grand time throwing dry flies. And it's a simple way to do it. We get a lot of folks in the shop that are just starting out fly fishing, and rather than overwhelm them with rigging and multiple fly rigs and all that kind of stuff, a dry fly is a very pure way of just getting somebody started.
I think that's a great word. There's a purity to it.
Oh yeah.
That's pretty sweet.
Well, isn't that what we call, the purists are the dry fly anglers?
That's true. That's what they say.
I think purist is just somebody who likes to limit themselves no matter what they do. Streamer purists, dry fly purist, nymphing purist, carp purist. We won't mention any names. Really.
Oh yeah! Wow.
No, I know you're not a carp purist. I love carp. Don't get me wrong.
I'm just a warm water purist.
Yeah, he's a warm water purist.
I'm just a fishing purist. I don't care about any of the rest of that. But anyway, pure or not pure, it is just it's an easy way to get somebody started in it. I know, like my family, my wife and kids, they favor dry fly fishing for sure. They like seeing the fish take it. It's a little easier to handle the cast. It's easier to maintain. They don't have to constantly adapt the rig. Just put a little floating on there and go.
How better to sell somebody on fly fishing?
I mean, that's the thing. I was hoping I could do that with my family, just have everyone get set up and get a dry fly eat, but it hasn't happened. And I don't know, we're on like year 2 now of us trying to get the whole family into this thing.
Cool.
My brother, my sister, my dad, my cousin.
Taking bluegill fishing.
Yeah, I need to do that. The other thing we should mention is, because we've just been talking about trout, but there's the other warm water, top water, dry fly type thing. So maybe you can just mention that a little bit right now.
Sure. I mean, in the world of warm water, I think you have kind of two things, or at least the way that I look at it is that you have your standard, top water flies, which are like your poppers and your big like foam bugs like damsels and Mr. Wigglies and stuff like that, which are...
What'd you call me?
Mr. Wiggly. The guys up in Wisconsin, they come up with some cool stuff, and it's, just big foam bugs with a lot of legs on them. I think the main difference between warm water and trout is that we're still imparting, well, I guess you still would do it for trout for sometimes, but you're imparting some motion on these flies. It's not a particularly dead drift. You're twitching with a popper, it has a specifically cupped face. You'll make noise to call the fish out, and I think, you have, poppers and foam bugs kind of lumped into one, and then you have your deer hair bugs, which, can be frogs. You have some diving bait fish, and even mice, at that point that you can fish very actively. You're typically hitting the shore and stripping these flies right into a relatively shallow area, where you'll find frogs and mice and, bait fish that are not happy and making some noise on the surface of the water to get these fish. I've caught smallmouth on your standard match the hatch flies, but, typically we're kind of calling these fish to us. So you're attractor fishing with dry flies for these warm water species.
Yeah, but I also saw you catch a smallie on like a freaking, I don't know, it was like 2.5-inch dragonfly pattern. That was sick.
Oh man, and that's still a match the hatch, and that's the cool thing is that you can have that thing was it's like a size 2 dragonfly, and just dead drift that down. It's cool stuff, and the guys out east right now, they're crushing it. They're getting kind of everything on cicada patterns right now. They're getting carp, they're getting smallmouth. I've even seen guys catching catfish on cicada patterns. It's nuts.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah. And if you want to do it even for the big toothy critters, like I know guys that'll fish blockhead poppers for muskies during the summertime. It's not topwater dry fly fishing, if you still want to call it that, is a very...
You just air quoted, ladies and gentlemen.
Depending on, if we're talking to purists, you might not call that dry fly fishing, but if it's sitting on top, I'd call that dry fly.
We don't like talking to purists anyway, so we'll just count them out.
There you go. Yeah, man. Shoot, even saltwater, like you get popping bugs and salt for albies and stripers and that sort of stuff.
That's true.
Totally. Yeah, there's all jacks you can get on. I mean, you could get all kinds of stuff on the surface, right? GTs.
Oh,
and
yeah.
And then the other one we haven't mentioned is like waking flies, whether that's for Pacific salmon or Atlantic salmon. A lot of the anadromous fish you can skate, dry flies or pink pollywogs or that sort of stuff on the surface. I would still kind of classify as dry flies, even though you're waking them a bit. But fish to come up and take them right off the surface, just like a mouse for trout or pike or bass.
Sure.
That's a great one. I've never heard of that, a pink pollywog.
The mad bombers too.
That's cool.
When you get bored, I haven't looked, but I'm sure if you Googled, pink pollywog fishing for silver salmon, it's a fun way to catch salmon in frog water, in a technical term there, but slower sections or eddies of larger rivers where the salmon are potted up, kind of resting. You wake a little surface. Think like bright fluorescent pink mouse looking type pattern that just disturbs them. We don't know what they're eating it as, but they're not really in there to feed. I think it just irritates them, but they'll come right up and take it right off the surface. It's pretty cool.
Is that a fly that originated in the UK?
The pollywog, I don't know where it originated. I'm most familiar with it from fishing Alaska. I would imagine that it's a Pacific salmon sort of thing. So if I were guessing, I would say it originated in Alaska.
It is curiously lovely when you say it with a British accent.
The pink pollywog. Jeez, have some crumpets.
I saw a pink pollywog in the Renaissance one time. He was chewing on aluminium.
Pink pollywogs, those salmon like a bit of a slap and tickle, do they?
There goes the UK audience.
There goes the UK audience. Bunch of Yanks trying to do our voices.
We love you, UK fam. Let's just start talking a little bit about how do we do it. We've talked about when seasonally, when you do, when you don't. We talked about why you would, told some stories, we've made some jokes. Let's just talk about how we're going to catch fish with a dry fly. So I think the best way to do this is to actually give us the real life scenario where we've just hiked I don't know, what season should we pick? Should we pick the easy ones? Of course, right?
Naturally.
I would say for dry fly fishing, there's no better time than early summer. There's even a hatch.
Summertime and the living's easy.
Where it's summertime, we just hiked through a forest. We're gonna get to this beautiful little spot of water. Maybe you should talk about, where's the most ideal place to try it out. I mean, what kind of water would we want for a beginner?
To make it easiest, I would say pocket water would be just, a small alpine freestone type stream. Doesn't have to be real alpine, I suppose, but freestone stream where it's not flat water. It's got some riffles or pockety type stuff to break up the current, so you can get pretty close to the fish. And
we're back in Utah
or Colorado or Idaho or Wyoming or Montana. Or the ideal situation is a higher gradient stream with maybe small to medium sized fish that are very agreeable, very user friendly fish, and clear water, broken texture on the surface so that we can get relatively close to those fish. Not too flat, water wise, so that the impact of the line and leader and fly hitting the water doesn't scare the fish. That would be a pretty ideal situation.
Okay, perfect. So that's the spot we're at right now, just serendipitously.
That's where we are, as fate would have it.
Yes. So, but we haven't done anything yet. So we're going to put our rod together, and we're going to put our reel on the rod, put the fly line through. We got everything set up. We got the fly line out. What kind of leader are we putting on here?
Nylon leader, and the length and diameter are going to vary depending on the size of our fly and how the conditions, how spooky the fish might be, how windy is it, how clear is the water. There's lots of variables.
But for a beginner, we just got to get them kind of throwing something.
We're on our stream that we just drew up with Pablo Picasso.
Yes.
Our virtual stream. So the virtual stream, I'm going to probably set somebody up with a 7.5 to 9 foot, maybe 5X leader, let's say.
Okay. So you're saying we have like medium to smaller trout? Is that what you said?
Sure.
Are you going to put any tippet on that?
You could. If you're fishing a single dry, you don't need to. The leader is ready to be fished, but you certainly could add tippet to it. That wouldn't hurt anything. It would lengthen the leader, so it would make it a little bit more difficult to cast if it's really windy, but it would also get you a little bit more slack in the leader. When you add thin part to the leader, it would make the leader and tippet not turn over maybe completely, to the point where you have a little bit of slack in the system where you might get a little longer drag-free drift by adding some tippet to it.
Okay. And while we were walking through the woods to get here, Ray stopped me, and he actually was like, hey, check this out. There's a bunch of little like red flying ants everywhere. Maybe we should use those as flies. Should we do that?
Absolutely, if you're seeing some on the water.
Okay,
yes.
So this is something that's important. So you want to kind of pay attention. Two things. Number one, you want to pay attention to what kind of insects you're seeing while you're walking through the forest. But as Lance said, you want to make sure that they're actually in the water. Maybe we'll switch this to a grasshopper, because I feel like that's a more common one that you would find in the stream, although the flying ant is kind of a deadly fly.
Ants are great, yeah.
Let's just say we saw some grasshoppers where like you're walking down the path and you see them jumping out of the grass because they're avoiding you. You get to the river, we're going to put on a hopper pattern. What size should we use?
It's something that's close to what you're seeing around, that when you're scaring them as you walk. If they're 1 inch long hoppers, you want to pick a fly out of your box that's about that same size.
Ding, 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 ding.
That is the correct answer.
So we tie on a hopper that matches the ones we've seen, and now we're kind of set up. We're ready to go, right? We got to get in position. We got to figure out where we're going to fish. So got this pockety water. Let's just say there's like a big boulder, and then there's a bunch of like little ones, and there's like this, little pocket thing coming down. The river's going from left to right. Where would you want to cast when you get to this scenario?
Well, that's a hard one to describe, because that could be anywhere. Hoppers are most commonly, they're a terrestrial insect, so they live on the land. So you're most effective most of the time fishing them nearer to the banks, right?
Okay.
In a small stream, you could find them anywhere, and even on big rivers, you'll find them mid-river at times because they get blown in as they try and fly across the river and so on. But I would be fishing near a bank, right behind that boulder. You're looking for depressions in the river, where the shallowest parts of the river don't usually hold fish. They can, but the very shallowest part doesn't often have fish. So you might look for something that's at least, the depth of the fish's back plus another, maybe double that.
Okay.
And ideally something that's quite a bit deeper. So again, depending on your stream, if our little stream is maybe 20 feet wide, then it maybe has an average depth of 2 feet, let's say. Then you're looking for 2 to 3 foot depth water, maybe a little shallower sometimes on an edge or in a tail out. And then you're looking for slower speeds. The fastest water isn't likely to have fish. The shallowest water isn't likely to have fish. You're looking for those exceptions. You're looking for slightly slower water where the fish don't have to use as much energy to hang in, and slightly deeper water where the fish can be a little more camouflaged from avian predators.
Okay, so when you cast this fly out, are you trying to get the fly to land in any particular area then? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely, yeah. You don't want to just haphazardly throw it. You want to be very precise with your casting and your presentations. You want to cast it immediately upstream of where you suspect a fish might be hanging, and then allow it to drift naturally the same speed as the current in which the fish is feeding, or where you think the fish might be feeding.
Okay, what's a good measurement of how far ahead of the fish we should try and place the fly?
Lots of variables there again. The more broken the water is, the closer you could land the fly to the fish. With a hopper in particular, or a lot of terrestrial insects, they end up hitting the water with a kind of an audible plop. They'll splat the water because they're usually ending up on the water catastrophically, versus a light dainty mayfly might set on the water very softly.
Mm-hmm.
So a trout can oftentimes and will oftentimes react to just the sound of the fly actually hitting the water.
Do you think that happens in pocket water also?
Absolutely. When float fishing, we're pounding banks a lot, and it's amazing how often you get a fish that reacts just to the plop of the fly. That if you dead drifted it over that same area, and cast it 10 feet upstream and drifted over it, you probably wouldn't have caught that fish. But because there was a fish within inches of where that fly hit, and they heard that splat, they react immediately and take the fly. But that applies certainly to our little pocket water stream as well.
Okay.
In Pablo Picasso world. So
yeah, of course. Salvador Dali, actually.
My bad.
With the melting trees.
Yeah, the melting trees.
The shallower the water is, and the more flat the water is, the more calm the water is, you need to probably lead that fish with that fly further and further upstream, so that the impact of the fly and the line don't scare the fish. A longer leader is going to be better in that situation, versus more pockety situations would dictate that you won't often get a long drag-free drift in pocket water, because pocket water is designated by having lots of conflicting currents. So in that case, you need to land the fly pretty near the fish. I would say no more than 3 or 4 feet upstream, and more commonly 1.5 feet upstream of where you think that fish might be.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
From the vise to the boat, to the bank, to those moments you connect to a fish, Loon Outdoors is with you every step of the way, with tools designed at the bench and on the water to help make your best day on the water better.
Let's just say that we did that. We just cast the fly. We got it maybe 2 feet up above where we think there's a fish. Where I'm assuming we're trying to hit maybe a seam where there's a slow water that's hitting kind of that fast water that's going over the boulders. Is that correct?
Yeah, you'd hit a seam or covering a depression, an area where you can use your polarized glasses and see where the river gets a little deeper.
Okay.
You're in pocket water, you're going to end up covering a lot of water. So when you're fishing dries, unless you're seeing numbers of fish rising in a small area in front of you, you're generally going to be more effective to cover lots of water, find likely areas, and just keep casting. Make more than one presentation at each, but you probably don't need more than half dozen to 10 presentations at each spot, and then covering water looking for fresh fish.
One of the earlier podcasts, we were talking about gear, and we were talking about waders, and you said the big reason that we wear waders is to position ourselves.
True.
So how would we position ourselves? What's the optimal position to be fishing pocket water with a dry fly?
Well, most of the time I would say it's best fished from downstream. So the current is as you're facing upstream, the current is coming at you directly into your running into the front of your legs as you stand. That again, all situational, but generally speaking, upstream. That way, you're showing the fly to fish that haven't seen you, versus if you work downstream, you need to stay a little further away because the fish are staring directly upstream at you.
Okay, right. Because the fish are always kind of staring
into the current.
Into the current, right.
Correct. So if, there's so many variables here, but you could fish down and across to a fish in a pocket water situation. But most of the time in pocket water, the majority of situations you'd be fishing upstream and then sometimes straight upstream, sometimes quartering across. With in relation to the waders and your positioning, it's important to be able to be mobile and move in the river so that you can work on getting your fly line and leader to land in the same speed of current or slightly slower current than where you're trying to fish. Because if your line and leader land in faster current between you and the slower current you're trying to present your fly, you're going to get drag. You're going to have those faster currents pull your line and leader downstream faster than the pocket in which your fly is drifting. So using your waders, or wet wading, you don't have to have waders on, but moving it position-wise in the river is really important. Wet wading being fishing without waders, but still getting in the river, usually wearing wading boots and neoprene socks, that sort of thing.
This is Pisces, Varies, an NATK segment where I, Jen Ripple, define fishy words for you. Boom! Wet wading, verb. Wet wading is the act of fishing while standing in water without using waders to keep the angler dry. Example in context. Yo, man, I'm not standing in line all day for those BTS tickets. Why not? Because it's supposed to rain all day long, and there is no way I'm wet wading.
All right, so I got into the river. I've got my fly ready. I know I said that I cast earlier, but I did not cast. I'm going back now because we didn't talk about
You're
positioning.
observing.
Yeah, we were observing. We were like mentally imagining where we were going to place the fly. So we walked into the river stealthily, toe first, and we got to the spot where we are ready if you think it's a good place to cast from. Optimal casting spot, AKA. And we're going to try and cast up to this seam. I'm just kind of trying to replay what you just said in my real world scenario that's happening right now.
Okay.
So I see a little depression. I saw it earlier when I was on the bank.
Observing.
Downstream, observing. I walked downstream, got in downstream of what I saw because I don't want to spook the fish. And now I'm kind of creeping up and walking towards the depression, and I'm about, let's say, 20 feet away now.
Okay.
I have everything ready. Now I need to do something to my fly, right? Because we're about to cast a fly that's expected to float. Walk me through that little step there.
Yeah, so there's a product called fly floatant, right, that comes in different forms, but most commonly it's a paste that you would work into the fly. There are different types of paste for different types of flies. For instance, CDC, we've talked about this a little bit before, I believe, but CDC is a type of feather that requires slightly different floatant, but you need floatant on the fly. Ideally, I like to put floatant all the way down my leader, with the exception of maybe the last 20 inches or so of tippet, so that the butt section of my leader rides high as well. It's more mendable that way. When I go to lift the fly off, it doesn't pull the fly under and make a loud plop, an audible pop as it's being lifted from the water, because it's not dragging through and underneath the water, underneath the surface.
Okay.
Instead stays on top. So I want to dress my line to leader connection with floatant. I want to dress my tapered leader with floatant down, with the exception of the last couple feet or so. And then I'm going to put floatant also on the fly.
We just did all that then. We've dressed the leader and we've dressed the fly. She's wearing a pink ballerina outfit right now. And we are ready to cast this thing out. So I'm looking directly upstream. Am I just going to do like your regular old straight up overhead cast? What cast am I using for this? Let's just assume there's not a lot of wind. It's just like a typical nice, bluebird day.
You certainly could. Your overhead cast or roll cast could both be good options depending on the conflicting currents in front of you. You might have to do an aerial mend where you're repositioning the line before it lands. You might have to make a cast that's a little beyond your targeted area and then do an on the water mend. Mending is just repositioning the line, whether it's in the air or after it's landed on the water.
So I'm assuming the water is coming at us kind of fast in pocket water typically, right? It's moving a little bit faster. So if I cast out straight, I'm standing in the seam, basically just downstream of the fish.
Perfect.
I'm casting out. Am I trying to land the fly line right on that seam, or do I want to have it land in the softer water?
Either or. The softer water, if it's significantly slower, when you say softer, you mean slower, I think, right?
Yes,
I use
correct.
that same term. That slightly slower water, if it's significantly slower, then that will also create drag. So you might be best to have your line and leader all land in the same speed of current if that's possible.
Okay.
If that's not possible, then you would choose slower water over faster water, and then mend and reposition the line after it's landed to compensate for the slower currents.
Okay, so I'm casting actually in the faster water then, and then mending towards the fast water? Is that what you're saying?
No, you'd be casting, ideally you're casting your fly, line, and leader all in the same speed of current is the ideal situation. That doesn't happen very often, but if you could...
Which speed, though? Is it the slower one or the faster one?
It's the seam speed is the ideal situation. So
I
that
see. So the
your
seam's
fly, line,
wide.
and leader, ideally, it's wide enough to have them all in the same speed. That doesn't happen very often. So most of the time, you're going to err on the side of putting your fly in that seam and then having your line and leader in the slightly slower water rather than faster.
So in order to do that, you're going to cast on the seam and then mend over into the slower water, correct?
You could. My ideal situation would be an aerial mend where you don't have to have it land and then reposition it. You just set it up that way to begin with, where the fly and end of the tippet land right where you want it in the seam, and the rest of the line lands off to its right or off to its left, depending on the situation, to where it's in slightly slower water out of the gates without having to move anything else.
If I may, in doing that, you're also making sure that your fly line and leader do not line the fish too.
True.
Hey, that was a jinx.
That's for flinching, sucker.
Ray has a great point there, and by lining it, he means putting your line or leader right over the top of the fish, which can sometimes scare them.
That's right.
Usually, I think from the impact of either of them more so than just seeing it. Seeing the line won't bother them at all, but having the impact of it hitting the water will send them running for their life.
And if you're interested about the aerial mend, we talk a lot about it in a previous podcast about casting. It's a great trick. Obviously, it's a little bit more advanced. You kind of have to learn how to overhand cast first.
True.
But if you're practicing like you're supposed to be, people...
You gotta practice your casting, okay? Did you think the coach was gone, okay? He's still here, okay?
Then practice. A perch is a perch. Then you should be fine. You should be able to do it. So just keep that in mind. If you can't do it, though, then you'll just cast straight up into the seam, and then you'll just move your rod tip in order to lift the line a little bit without moving the fly is ideal into the softer water. When you're fishing dry flies, a lot of time if you have very spooky fish, when you go to recast and you do that first pickup on your stroke coming off the water, it causes a pop or splash. I was curious if you do the roll cast pickup ever to avoid that.
Yeah, you sure can. I find it's not necessary most of the time. I like to put floatant on my, I put like Payette paste all the way down my leader, the tip of my fly line, and down the butt section of my leader, leaving just the last little bit of tippet without floatant. So if you do that, it doesn't pull under and make it much of a plop or a splash when you lift the dry fly off, but certainly doing the little roll cast trick before you lift off can help. That's not going to hurt anything, I don't think.
Okay.
I would advise people not to lift the fly off until it's, your line and leader and fly are well downstream of where you're trying to fish.
Right.
Because if, classic rookie mistake I see guiding all the time when we get in pods of rising fish is people make a cast and it's like 3 feet left of where they want it to go, but the fly's still kind of in the general vicinity where the fish are rising, and they just rip that sucker back off the water and all the fish get put down. And then they're like, oh, they stopped rising. You're like, gee whiz, I wonder why.
Golly gee.
It sounded like a pterodactyl or possibly an osprey just hammered the water right next to where they were rising, and that, for some reason,
fish don't like that?
Daylights out of them. Yeah,
that's really funny.
So yeah, you want to make sure your fly and leader and tippet are well downstream of where you're trying to fish before lifting it off, no matter how you're going to take it off the water, just so you don't risk scaring those fish before you get a chance at getting them to eat your fly.
Going back to the drift now.
So then what happens is the fly is getting taken down by the current, and it will come down. Now this is a tricky situation now that I'm thinking about it, because the fly is going to be coming down faster than the fly line, right? Because the fly line is now in the soft water, aka slow water. The fly is in the faster water, so as the fly comes down, it's now passing the tip of my fly line. What do you do then?
So then you mend and reposition downstream, so you'd be moving your fly line and the butt end of your leader downstream as the dry fly drifts, you're staying ahead of it slightly, trying not to move the dry fly during its drift. So it's a careful process, and it sounds harder than it really is. But if you saw somebody do it on the river, you could quickly learn how to mend and manipulate that line and leader.
Question, because I don't know this. How do you mend downstream?
Lift with the rod and mend downstream instead of up.
Mm-hmm. But you're standing straight up, so downstream is like towards you.
Well, if you're casting straight upstream, then your line should ideally be all in that same current. If you're standing slightly off right or left of straight upstream to where you're casting, then you could still mend downstream. You can pick up
Right.
line and move it up or down slightly.
Okay, so when you were talking about this, you were talking about almost quartering a little bit downstream.
A tiny bit, yeah.
Okay.
It would be rare, I would say, to fish, being mid-river, to fish straight upstream. It's possible, but it's rare. It's more common to fish straight upstream on a bank, and even then, it seems it's really rare to be having absolutely as straight as an arrow cast. You're almost always going to have your cast that angles just slightly off right or left. Even if you're trying to fish, if your fly even is going to land straight upstream of you, your line is usually going to land slightly off right or left of the fly.
Okay, that's true. I mean, there's a couple other, there's like the S cast you could do if you wanted to go straight upstream. I've done that
absolutely.
before.
Add some slack into it. That's a great cast.
I didn't like really try and dry fly fish quartering downstream or anything or upstream when I was in the Sierras that much. There was this time where I got like kind of stuck in this thing, and it was too deep kind of to move either way, so I got stuck on this like mound of sand that was like a straight line almost for a while. And in that case, I was forced to kind of just fish straight upstream. And there was these big boulders like kind of right and left of me on either side. So I was just hitting them like that and doing a little S cast.
Yeah, that's perfect.
It was a total noob guess, though.
Sounds like a great way to do it. I think it's important to point out also in the pocket water situation we're talking about, I think most anglers have in their head that they cast the fly out and drift it as long as they can until it like swings out behind them downstream. And in pocket water, that's a complete waste of time because your fly is likely to get a drag-free drift for like 2 to 5 seconds max, right?
Right.
That sounds short, I know, when we talk about it on a podcast, but if you put a stopwatch out there as far as when your fly actually hits the water and when it starts getting drag, it's not often going to be very long. So in pocket water situations, keep in mind that you're going to be making a lot of presentations, but very short presentations where your fly drifts, 1 to 5 or 6 feet most of the time, and then it's out off the water and right back in after a couple of false casts.
Okay, great. And yeah, I just want to go back and kind of really punctuate the fact that when we're talking about the angle that we're fishing at, he's saying upstream, but it's almost like slightly diagonal and upstream. That's what we mean by quartering. So picture all these things slightly diagonal because that's important. All right, cool. So let's just say that we did this. We actually casted slightly upstream. We mended downstream. We got our line in the soft water. We've repositioned our line again for the second time. We've mended again. What do you know it? Mr. Brown Trout comes up. Although in pocket water, we might probably have a better chance of catching a rainbow, right? If it's a little faster.
You never know. Lots of brown trout in pocket water, too. Could be either one. Whichever. Right. Insert your favorite species.
Okay. Goldfish.
Your favorite trout species.
Sea monkey.
I got to be more specific.
Let's just say brown comes up, takes the fly. Now, let's talk a little bit about hook set here because I know that's a very important player in this. The tendency when you get hit on a dry fly, especially the first 2 trips, is to just set the hook really fast, okay? So first and foremost, there's a way to set the hook on a dry fly. Well, let's talk about that before we talk about the speed.
Well, a way to set the hook on a dry fly is usually with I would call it I don't know, what's the right term here? Concise, that's not the right word.
Swift.
Quick but controlled lifting of the rod, usually in the downstream direction of the current, so that you're trying to pull the fly into the fish's mouth rather than out. Assuming you're fishing from downstream, like we were describing there.
Okay.
If you're fishing down and across, you would change that to a cross stream set oftentimes to try and pull the fly into the corner of the fish's mouth. But you're going to set the hook. You're lifting the rod to do that with a crisp but not too accentuated, not too aggressive type of rod movement. So you want to get tight on the fish, but you don't want to break it off. You're usually fishing pretty thin tippet with dry flies. So if you pull really hard, you're likely to snap that fish off.
Kind of like in fly fishing popular culture up until now, you always see people setting straight up. I used to call it Statue of Liberty. Is that something that's like not advisable?
Depends on what you're doing. Where the fish is, how is the fish angled, where is your fly. If the fish was upstream of you at a quartering angle, straight up would be great, right? or maybe up and slightly to the side to try and pull. You're just trying to pull that hook right into the fish's mouth, right?
Okay.
So you don't want to pull it straight upstream out of their mouth. So you want to lift in a way that the hook is going to make contact with the fish.
All right, so we know how we're going to set the hook. We're going to set it slightly downstream and up in a controlled manner, but swiftly. Now, let's talk a little bit about timing.
Perfect.
Because I think that that's one of the things that I missed when I first started. The first time I tried to do dry fly fishing by myself was in the driftless, the first time I went. And I got to this spot, there was a bunch of brookies. It was just beautiful, but I missed, I would say, 90% of the fish. And I think it all has to do with how fast I was setting the hook. Can we talk a little bit about the differences and when you would do what as far as speed goes and hook set?
Yeah, there's to me, if you're going to make a generalization, I think the generalization is that you're better off with dry flies most of the time to be late than early.
Okay.
I would argue that you're best off to kind of match the speed of the rise. So generally speaking, you're going to see, like little brookies a lot of times will quickly attack a dry fly. They eat it really fast versus maybe a feeding brown trout or a cutthroat might be more methodical and slowly come up and kind of engulf the fly at a much slower pace. And I think in those situations, your set can kind of mirror what you're seeing the fish do. With the brookie, you could be a little quicker, and it doesn't have to be a brookie. Even a small brown trout could do the same thing. But when the fish are rising with pace and taking your fly with pace, you can be a little quicker on the set oftentimes, versus the more slow, deliberate, and methodical the trout are at taking your fly, the longer you need to wait before setting the hook. So I think most people that miss fish are missing them most of the time because they set too early. That's why I was teasing you earlier in this podcast about when I asked if when you're seeing those fish come up in the crystal clear water, watching them take your fly, all of our tendency as we see those fish come rising through the water column, the second their lip touches the hackle or touches the tail, we're setting the hook, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I did.
Knee-jerk reaction is to set way too early, versus ideally when you see them come from that far and then just slowly come up and methodically take your fly, you need to wait for them to actually drop back down below the surface and then tighten up. And that's really hard to do. It sounds easy, but it takes nerves of steel when you've watched our fish rise from the bottom in clear water to come take your fly.
Yeah,
so generally speaking, if you're missing a bunch of fish, the first thing I do is slow down and be late. It's amazing how often, especially with foam flies, whether you're on the river or the lake, we can be on the lake with fly fish food. We do this a lot. We can be on the river or the lake for that matter and have a dry fly out there, and it happens more on the lake, but where it's just out there bobbing in the waves and somebody else hooks a fish. So one of the guys picks up a camera to start filming one of the guys that just hooked a fish, and the other rig is out there, and while he's filming, a fish eats the fly on a rod that's unattended, and the guy hurries and sets the camera down, takes 2 steps over in the boat to grab the other rod and still has time to set the hook, which is way late, but the fish is still on there.
Right.
Versus if that angler probably would have had the rod in their hand and they saw the fish come up to take it, they would have set too early and totally missed that fish. So anyway, it's better to be late than early.
There's a couple things that are generalizations that I'll add to that, and if you don't agree with them, please obviously pipe up. But the first one would be that smaller fish tend to do it way faster. They're like splashy, is what I like to call them.
Yes.
And the bigger fish are way slower. It's like a blue whale compared to, I don't know, a little like
dolphin,
whiting or something.
Most of the time, that's true. I would agree. And then little fish, a lot of times, you're just going to miss the fly. They're not going to get it in their mouth. You have stiff hackles or elk hair or something that they're going to try and get it, and they're going to, in their effort, they're going to push it away. And so you won't actually miss them. They will miss the fly a lot of times. Where a large fish sometimes can miss the fly, but not very often.
The other thing that goes along with this observation thing that we've been talking about, obviously in order to see a fish and how fast it's hitting the fly, that's all part of observation. But one thing we haven't really talked about at all is using your ears. That's a big part of the dry fly eat, is the sound. People talk about the slurp and stuff like that. I think on these quicker, faster takes, a lot of times you won't even be fishing, but you'll hear fish that are rising, and you'll hear it real fast and splashy, and you can assume it's probably a smaller fish. If you hear a slurpy, slow kind of gulp sound, you can assume it's the fat stack. Are you with me on this?
Most of the time, yeah. There are times and places. There are places I fish that have really large fish that I don't know. It's amazing how often you'll spot a fish rising. Some of these are larger rivers where we're either fishing out of the flycraft or the drift boat, and show off. Sorry, I wasn't trying to show off. but we're fishing. You're seeing a rise form, but you're not often seeing the fish itself.
Yeah.
And some places I fish often, you can't tell the difference from the rise form, whether it's a really most of the fish are all pretty good size. They're all, let's say, 15, 16 inches plus. But it's hard to tell the difference sometimes between. We'll come around a bend and see 2 or 3 heads up and go, oh, they all look like 15 inches, and we're hoping to catch bigger fish, and you're like, oh, they're rising, let's get them anyway. And you sting the first one and it's like 22, and you're okay, that didn't look anything like that, because they're just barely. Some of the largest fish will make really small dimples for sure, so they're not leaving a large splash, versus just like you're saying, the small fish will be a splashy rise. It doesn't necessarily have to just be it won't make a big disturbance. It would just be a little more splashy at times. But then again, midge fishing on our local tailwaters, you'll have fish that are 12 inches and fish that are 20 inches that are sipping midges, and they'll look about the same when they're eating, versus when you hook them, they don't feel the same. I also feel like a lot of times you're in a stream that's dominated by small fish, right? And when that happens, you see a whole bunch of small splashy rises, versus when you see a river that, each fishery has an average sized fish, let's say, right?
Okay.
And so you're not likely to just all of a sudden encounter a whole bunch of 8 inchers, and then around the bend there's a whole bunch of 25 inchers. That doesn't happen very often. Right? You might get the outlier, but most of the time they're all going to be pretty similar. So when that happens, you're likely to see a bunch of small fish rising that are all splashy, or you're likely to see some more mid to larger sized fish that are almost look like the same rise form.
Sometimes you'll even see fish actually just come out of the water. You'll see their entire back arc. That's kind of like the dream. That's happened to me 2 times. One time in the Sierras, and then another time it was end of May when I went to Pennsylvania. This nice brown that I caught. I watched him rise like 3 times, and his whole body came out. It was nuts. It looked like a dolphin.
He's leaping out of the water, full body out.
No, just like it looks like a dolphin when they come out.
How they porpoise?
Yeah, it's like
because a lot of times we would describe emerger eating fish, pupa eating fish, as porpoising rises, where their head doesn't actually break the surface. You see more of their back just behind their head, their dorsal fin, and a little bit of their tail as they kind of shark through it. You don't see the head, where a fish, if the surface. The head of the fish is breaking the surface, you'd get more of your typical rise, where you're seeing the head, and then the head drops down, maybe a little bit of the dorsal, but no tail.
Interesting. So you think they were taking emergers?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say based on what
I caught
you're
them
seeing.
on a dry fly.
On a dry fly, yeah, but if they're looking up at emergers, they would oftentimes be opportunistic and take a dry fly still. It's hard to say. On my local tailwater, the Provo, we get all the time people seeing, especially when the caddis are out and when the midges are out, you see a whole bunch of porpoising rising, where they're not actually eating the adult off the surface, but it looks like they are because they break the surface to the untrained eye, where people come in and they're like, they are rising everywhere, and I couldn't get them to eat any of my dry flies. And you go, did they, you describe the porpoising rise. Were they doing more of this? They're like, yeah, exactly. And you're like, okay, those are emerger eating fish. They're eating pupa right below the surface. And so you
actually see their whole body, but
you don't really see their head. You see their back, their dorsal fin, maybe their adipose, and a tiny bit of tail.
Okay, interesting. That's crazy.
I had a Chilean dude in the store the other day that was talking about how where he fishes the browns and rainbows, they will actually breach and catch dragonflies midair.
Yeah, that's kind of more what I was thinking, Pablo, where you're talking about it, where they're leaping all the way out. Yeah, there's videos on the internet of that where they're like leaping out, eating big mayflies, eating damsels, dragons, that sort of stuff.
Okay, no, that's not what happened. It was like a full on, just like what a dolphin would do, just like a roll,
Yeah.
Okay, so
if they're coming from deep, I think you could argue if a fish came from deep, they're carrying a fair bit of momentum. It may carry them through a fly a little more aggressively that way. I've seen some footage of high altitude fish, both brookies, cuts, as well as grayling commonly do this, where they come up with such vigor that their speed kind of carries them out of the water a little more when they're trying to take a dry. Where fish that are selectively feeding on hatching insects that are more in a rhythm, they're already right at the surface rather than coming from deep. They're near the surface, and they're going to be a much less splashy, much more deliberate, slow, methodical type of rise right at the surface. They're not carrying much motion or much momentum. It's a big word.
Zip sauce.
Those fish aren't carrying as much momentum as they go to the surface. They're already at it. They just lift slightly, move their pectoral fins a little bit, and up they go, and their head sips through the surface, and they drop back down a couple inches.
Well, my mind's blown. I don't know about you, Ray, but that's legit. I'm so glad. See, this is the joys of being the noob on the show is you can siphon all this stuff out. I hadn't heard about that.
We're all noobs. Everybody's learning as we go. We'll keep saying that.
Yeah, I know. It's true. And we're all still learning.
We are. We're all learning.
You're learning how to read my jokes, and I'm learning how to fish. So we've talked a lot about that. Let's just say that as a fish taking emergers, we saw him actually be like a dolphin, but this time he was taking my dry fly.
Perfect.
So we've hooked him now, okay? The thing takes it. We set the hook downstream, right?
Lifting the rod up slightly downstream.
And now we got to play this thing,
okay?
Which is also something that we have not discussed at all. We've only talked about fighting fish in an alley in Chicago on this podcast. So now let's kind of talk. Let's walk through a little bit and talk about fighting fish, because one of the things about fly fishing is we have these extra long rods and we have this tippet or even the end of your leader. A lot of times it's very thin diameter stuff, so you can't get as horsey as you can sometimes if you're fishing bait. You kind of have to play the fish a bit, and you kind of want to play them enough so you can bring them in, but you also don't want to completely exhaust the poor thing because you're catch and release, right?
Right.
Maybe you can walk me through this, and then there's also like the whole keep them wet movement and everything.
Yeah. So when you're playing the fish, it's important to keep tension on them, but too much tension, as you just put, will likely break them off on a fine tippet. So that is a skill that each angler will have to learn. What does how much pressure can your knots and your tippet hold, right? So if we said we were fishing a 5X tippet, let's say, so 5X in most brands is somewhere in the neighborhood of let's say 4 to 5.5 pound. Most of them would be right around 5 pound 5X. 5X is a diameter. I think we've covered this, but 5X has nothing to do with pound test, strictly diameter. But so that's why there's a range of breaking strengths in 5X. So you have that 5X tippet on, and even though it's 5 pound test, in the fish you hooked maybe is only 2 pounds, because you have a knot in the system, and because it's the 5 pound test is a straight breaking strain, not with knots and all that kind of stuff included in there. It's very easy to break off a 2 pound fish on 5 pound test tippet, if that makes sense.
Right.
So by applying too much pressure, you could break that fish off. So as you start to fish, if you're never breaking fish off, well, then you should probably start playing with that line, riding that fence and figuring out how much pressure can you apply without breaking the fish off, because then you can fight them faster. On the flip side, if you're always breaking them off, then you need to be having less bend in the rod and fighting them more daintily. You need to soften up the fight. So generally speaking, you want to kind of push the reel handle at the fish, because the handle of the rod and the reel at the fish to make your rod have a deeper bend.
Right.
What you don't want to do is be pointing the rod at the fish so that you have a straight line connection, because then you're taking away the absorption factor of the rod. So the reason that we have a rod is to cast the fly and then also to absorb shock as you're fighting the fish. So the rod bends and gives, and it protects your tippet. So you need to use that bend. The tip is the softest part of the rod. So if you're pointing the rod kind of almost straight at the fish, you're eliminating that soft tip section of the rod, and you're fighting the fish from the butt of the rod, which will then break those fish off. Also, when you hook a fish, it usually panics and wants to go away from where it just got hooked. It feels the piercing of that fly, and it wants to pull away from there. So you have to kind of brace yourself for an immediate run of the fish. So that means you're going to have to, with light tippet, you're going to have to give. You're going to have to let the fish take a little line. You do that by keeping tension on the line. Usually that's by pinching the line against the cork handle, but you have to allow line to slip as that fish is going. So there's a fine line there, and that's a learned skill. You're going to be allowing line to slip through your fingers while maintaining tension, because if you lose tension, there's a good chance that fish throws the hook. So long story short, you're keeping tension, you're getting tight, you're setting the hook, then you're maintaining tension as the fish fights. After that initial burst is over and the fish stops pulling line, then you should be taking up line. So you can do that by retrieving line, by stripping it in with your non-rod hand, or you can also reel in line by reeling the handle of the reel. Either one can work. We could get into details of that, but that's probably another podcast later for fish fighting.
I would say for a noob, they should avoid the reel in the beginning. Just
You think so?
strip the thing in. Yeah, because
Strip
it's
the
like a
thing in?
distraction. Then they're looking at the reel, they're not looking at the fish, and then it's just mayhem.
Well, especially
you
if a
could-
fish runs towards you too.
Yeah, you could argue both ways. I'm with you. I like to strip most of them in, but some people find it easier. Using the drag on your reel is usually more reliable than relying on your hand for tension when you're
True.
new. So you could go either way on that one. That's a double-edged sword. But,
All right, fair.
But I'm with you. Whichever is more comfortable for a new angler. You do have to first take up the slack. So if you have more fly line out than the fish is taken, you've got to be maintaining tension with your rod hand, reeling up the slack with your non-rod hand, and then once you get the slack up, you can then let the line out of your rod hand so it's no longer pinched between the cork handle and your finger, and you're just fighting it straight off the reel.
He was giving me thumbs up. I just gave him thumbs up back, but really he's holding an air rod.
Air rod, bro.
Yeah, and one thing I will mention that happens a lot in the beginning is you'll start to separate the hand that you're stripping line in with will end up holding the line, and then your rod is in the other hand. And then now you have these two hands that are separated by 3 feet.
Yeah, you don't want
and
that to happen.
It's mayhem. You got to keep the line always connected to the rod hand.
Correct.
So under your index finger of the rod hand.
Absolutely.
So if you strip in line, you got to strip in line and then put it underneath your bail, which is like your index finger.
It's worth saying too that when you are stripping the line in, it's always coming from behind your index finger. You don't want to reach in front.
Yeah, you're not
then
reaching
you'll
up.
lose.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I like that one, Ray. Absolutely. Yeah, you're not reaching between your rod hand and the first guide. You're not reaching above your rod hand. You're always taking line from the rod hand that's slipping through your 1, 2, 3, however many fingers you choose to use. You want to come back to that rod hand. This is a lot easier to describe if you could see our video, our gesturing here. But
Yeah.
hopefully as you're listening, you can imagine what we're talking about. What you don't want to do is, like Pablo said, you don't want to have the two hands separated with line only in one hand, because then you have to pull line from your non-rod hand. Let's say you're right-handed. You've got the rod in your right hand, and you're trying to strip line in with your left. If you don't take it from your hand, if you take it from above there, you pull it down, and then you got to find your right hand again. And it doesn't sound awkward, but it's really awkward.
It's
I
real
watch
tough.
people do it all the time, and it's really inefficient. So you want to use that control system, use that rod hand to collect the line, and then strip line in from basically by touching your two hands together and then pulling line through.
Yeah,
with your
you're
non-rod
stripping.
hand.
You're stripping from right behind your rod hand.
Search YouTube.
Yes.
You'll find what we're talking about. It's the same thing when you're taking up slack, whether you're nymphing or dry fly fishing. You're going to make a cast, and as the current brings the rig towards you, you need to be taking up slack. You don't want to be reaching up to that first guide on the rod to take up slack. You want to reach to your hand so that you have a repeatable place, that the wind's not blowing it away from your rod and that sort of thing.
Eventually, it
same thing.
becomes second nature, and you don't have to think about it. So that's the
Control
good news.
system.
Indeed, control isn't key.
Control is the key. New album by Kraftwerk.
So now we're fighting the fish. There's an important lesson that we teach in the alley about keeping the fish off balance.
There's a lot of important lessons we teach in the alley.
That's true. That's true. Keeping a fish off balance. So one of the things that you want to do when you have a fish on is if they're going to the right, if they're like taking off to the right, you want to move your rod to the left. And if they're going to the left, you want to move your rod to the right. You're basically just kind of countering every move that they make. You're doing the opposite direction just to kind of put a little bit more pressure on them, and that's kind of how you keep control of them. Also remember, wherever the fish's head goes is where the fish is going. So if you can move the fish's head to where you want it to go, you're now steering the fish.
Correct.
So that's an important thing too.
Anytime that the fish has stopped, if the fish is taking line, then you got to give, especially with light tippet, right? You can't just dead stop a fish that's on a run. So you're going to give. But the second they stop taking, you should be changing their direction, as Pablo's describing, turning their head towards you and then immediately taking up slack, keeping them moving your direction. And if you're just playing them, waiting for them to like swim right to you, you're going to exhaust the fish to the point where it's not going to live after you release it. You need to fight them as quickly as possible so that you are minimizing the fight and the lactic acid they're building up and having them use less oxygen, getting them to you as quick as possible. As Pablo mentioned earlier, keeping them wet is ideal. So you're landing them in a net, keeping them in the water, quickly sliding the hook out. You're going to take a picture, you're wetting your hands. Otherwise, you're just slipping them right back into the river as quickly and efficiently as possible and getting them back on their merry way to live and breathe and hopefully maybe even be caught another day.
That's right. But hold on. Well, first of all, to quote Mr. Lance Egan from his video, "Thank you very much, Mr. Brown."
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
That's what you say when you let go of the fish. But
that is what I say. Yeah, I don't know if everybody else does that.
I say it sometimes because I just copied you. Embarrassingly again. We kind of skipped a major part because landing the fish is kind of an ordeal. And if you do it wrong, it gets to be kind of a hairy situation. Talk me through this then. How do you land a fish?
You just got to strip down enough line that you can put pressure by getting the rod a deep C type bend in the rod and get the fish pulled directly upstream of you to your side and upstream, and then allowing the current to bring it right to you. We have in our modern nymphing series and our adaptive, both the modern nymphing videos and adaptive fly fishing video, we talk through this on, I don't know, maybe 50% of the fish that we catch. We walk people through their landing process over and over and over, so it can kind of get ingrained in your mind. But I missed that, obviously. You just want to the ideal situation, I would say, is getting them turned to where they're upstream and to the side slightly, and then at the last part of the fight, when the fish is showing signs of tiring, you kind of slide your rod across current, so that, if, again, the current's coming at you, so that the fish is sliding upstream of you, and then as soon as it gets almost immediately upstream of you, instead of moving your rod from left to right or right to left, you move it to where it's up a little bit, and then the fish comes right to the surface and the current brings it right to your net.
I see.
You can do the rod all the way back, but if you get the rod all the way back, your rod, instead of being bent like a standard rod would be during a cast, it's going to be cocked back. I don't know how you guys can see that.
Doubled down on itself?
Yeah.
It's going to be folding over to where you're short arcing just the tip section of the rod. And
like
fly
a fish
rods,
hook, you're saying, instead of...
Yeah, like the bend of a hook is exactly right. That's bad. So fly rods are designed to bend over the entire rod. So you could put a bend in the rod with almost the full C shape if the whole rod is bending equally, and not worry about it breaking. But if you just grab the tip and try to make a C shape out of just the tip or between a couple of guides, it'll break in an instant.
Right.
You don't want to short arc a rod. So
unless you have the hybrid tip. Don't forget about the hybrid tip.
Oh boy, the hybrid tip. Nobody knows what that thing is. So if you get your rod too far back behind you, you're going to short arc it, and you could land a fish that way, but you do risk breaking the tip.
I typically put my rod up and behind my head. So I'm going to try using this new technique. I've never broken a rod that way, I will say, though.
I'm betting it's not quite as behind you as you think. It's probably just more up.
That's actually true.
But maybe I'm wrong.
It's like this. You're right. It is. It's actually right above my head.
And then I would suggest that if you have a line to leader connection that is so poor that it's not going in and out of the guides very well, you need to change that. You need to improve it. Because even a loop-to-loop connection, as terrible as it is, and I'm a hater of those things, they're really convenient to change leaders, but they're terrible. But if you take the time to pull on the loop, the perfection loop on the end of the taper leader, tighten it up all the way, and trim that tag off so there's no tag there, that'll go in and out of your guides okay. I don't like it. I would cut it off, be the first thing I do to that line.
Yeah.
But if you're not ever getting your line to leader connection in your guides, you're going to be in big trouble if you're fishing leaders with any length at all.
And one option you could do, if you don't want to do the loop-to-loop, you can just do a clinch knot to the welded loop on your fly line if you have one.
True.
So that's a nice, slimmer way of doing it also.
Agreed.
So now we've landed the fish. Kind of walk us through that again. I know you did it quite quickly, but there's a process for, let's say the hook hasn't come out yet. A lot of times these barbless hooks, they just come right out.
They do. Yeah, so ideally you're landing the fish in a net. Not everybody fishes with a net, but it's best to do it with a net. Best because you can land a fish in a net faster because you don't have to tire it to a total exhaustion before it kind of gives up. So if you're not using a net, you're probably fighting the fish longer than is needed. Versus with a net, you can get them to where they're almost tired, scoop them in the net, hurry and take the fly out, and they've still got some zest left they can take off. Ideally, you're landing them in the net or to a hand. Either way, you want to have a wet hand. If your hand's dry, you are going to damage the fish. You're going to remove some of that protective slime that's protecting those fish from parasites and those sorts of things. So you want to wet your hands and before you hold the fish, or ideally you don't ever even touch the fish. In a net, a lot of times you can just reach down, pull a barbless hook out, and then drop your net back into the water and just let the fish swim straight out of it. If that's not possible, then you wet your hand, you grab hold of the fish. A lot of times, if the fish is being unruly, if you flip it upside down so that its belly is up, they'll calm down a fair bit more, and then you can carefully remove the hook. We would, I know you and Ray are right on board with me on this one, I'm sure. We would encourage everyone to use barbless hooks.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Whether that's to get them out of you or your fishing buddy, or they come out of the trees easier, they also come out of the fish easier. There's tons of barbless hook options these days, and we would encourage you to, even if you're tying on barbed hooks, just pinch the barbs so that they come out of fish that much easier. I think you'll find if you fight fish properly, you really won't lose any more flies that way, but you'll end up saving fish and you'll save flies because you won't have to damage the fly so much to get it out of the fish. So barbless hook, carefully remove it from the fish and slip the fish back into the current, ideally facing its head into the current and holding onto it until you feel it kicking a little, so it has a little bit of momentum to get back out into the river.
Okay, cool. And one question I actually did have, and I talked about this in an earlier podcast where I was doing like a dry fly only trip to really try and learn it, and a lot of the fish that I was catching were taking the fly a lot deeper than when I'm nymphing.
Okay.
So I was like, am I setting the hook too late, or is that just a symptom of dry fly fishing?
I think that's a symptom of fish that want to eat a fly really well. It's a small fly that's getting in their mouth, and probably you're fishing really light tippet, I would dare to guess.
Yeah, it was, yes.
I mean, that can be a good thing when you're missing a lot of fish, right? Going light tippet so the fish get it in a little better is a good thing. If you're hooking lots of them really deep, then you might consider either a slightly larger fly if you can get away with it, or a slightly thicker tippet so that it's not so easy for them to get it down in.
Okay.
On the flip side, if you're missing tons of them, go light.
That's great. I never would have even thought it was a tippet. Crazy. The amount of knowledge this man has, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get a round of applause.
The other thing to think about is the way that the fly is constructed. So a stiffer fly, an elk ear caddis, for instance, versus a corn-fed caddis, to give you kind of polar opposites. Corn-fed caddis is one of my patterns, so I'm biased that I like that fly better. But just comparing apples to apples, they're both imitating a caddis fly. An elk ear caddis has stiff hackle and stiff elk hair on it.
Yeah.
It's harder for the fish to get it in. Corn-fed has soft CDC that is much easier for the fish to take in. So if you consider what those flies are made from, one, the stiffer elk ear caddis, the fish would have a harder time getting it in as deep into their mouth because the full hackle on it and the stiff elk hair wing are going to impede its progress down the fish's throat, versus the really soft corn-fed or like a Spanish style dry fly that's got a CDC wing.
Yeah, that's what I was fishing. I was fishing the CDC.
I would have guessed that for sure. So a CDC pattern is just easier for the fish to get way in there, really deep.
Okay, interesting.
So
okay.
you could also possibly change that. If that was becoming a problem where you think it's hurting the fish, you could make the fly with a little bit stiffer materials and cut down on that a bit too.
Yeah, I've never seen that. I never really had that issue ever when I'm like nymphing, or I mean, honestly, even when I'm using a lot of terrestrials, but I guess it's probably because it's so big that it doesn't get very far.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was happening like pretty consistently.
Sure.
And I didn't have any forceps. I only had like saltwater like pliers, so it was just like freaking me out the whole time. I was feeling really bad. It was okay. I kind of got good at it, but it was not fun.
I like those catch and release tools. You ever seen those? They're people mock them.
I've never used them, but
they make fun of them all the time. But they're really convenient when a fish is hooked a little deeper, or even when they're not, when they're just on the edge. You slide the thing down and pop the hook out. It's got a great angle. Especially with a barbless hook, they slide hooks right out of the fish without needing to, get your forceps out and do any surgery.
All right, cool.
At that point, you're not ruining your fly either.
That's a great point. That's my favorite part about them. I use them a ton in the winter when I don't want to get my hands wet because it's too cold. I don't want my hands to be wet and cold. So I use the catch and release tool, slide it down and never even touch the fish. Just slide it back, it swims back out of my net. Or, just for efficiency, like Ray's saying, rather than grabbing the body of the fly with some forceps or pliers, you slide that catch and release tool down over the top of the hook, and it uses the metal on the bend of the hook to actually remove it, so you're not damaging the fly as much.
Very cool.
I'm going to go buy one now.
I know, I think I might too. We'll put a link in the show notes to the catch and release tool that Lance likes.
They come in 3 sizes. You might need more than one.
Okay, fair.
I don't use the mid size. I just use the big bug for larger size flies and the standard for everything else.
Okay, cool. More gear. Yay.
More gear.
And that's pretty much it. We caught a fish on a dry fly. Congratulations, everybody.
And we safely released it.
And we safely released it. And there's pictures to prove it. So
maybe. Hopefully not every fish. You don't need a picture of every fish, right?
Well, and you're a noob, you do. Yes.
Oh.
Every single one.
I see.
That's what we do. But no, you really don't. You should take 3 per trip. But I have been guilty of taking every single one. That's definitely a new thing.
We all take some pictures here and there. That's not going to harm anything. That's half the fun of the sport. But
you got to do it fast. That's the trick.
That is the trick. You don't want to keep them out of the water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. We talked all about dry fly fishing pretty in depth, or at least it feels that way. We did get on a tangent. I don't know if it's going to make it on this podcast, but
we do lots of tangents.
We do. But we've been chatting for a while now, so we're going to shut it down. We could probably talk about this for like another hour if we wanted to, but the next podcast is going to be on nymphing, which is super popular, and there's a bunch of different ways to do it. Talked a little bit about it before, but not like we're going to in the next podcast. And that one's actually going to be a two-parter, so you can look forward to kind of a general nymphing one. We're still going to get pretty deep in that, but then we're going to move on to kind of a special edition one on Euro nymphing, so that will be the follow-up. So stay tuned for the nymphing extravaganza here at the Noob of the Knower. Thanks so much for listening, guys. We have had a great time tonight. Hope you did too. Lance, you're a good man. Thanks for putting up with all my noobness.
Thanks for keeping us on the straight and narrow path here.
Next time we fish, I'll definitely have you land the fish for me. And Ray, thanks for showing up after fishing your guts out.
Hey, man. Happy to be here.
All right. Until the next one, everybody say bye. 1, 2, 3.
Bye.
This was a Raul Maria production.
Which part? The pterodactyl